Welkom. Dit is City Breaks Amsterdam, Episode 1. Hello and welcome. I hope that's what I said in Dutch, but I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, I'm Marion Jones, and this is City Breaks Amsterdam, a brand new series, Episode 1, in which, as per usual, I'm going to do some introducing, a little bit of geography, get your bearings if you like, a little bit of history so that everything that follows makes a bit of sense within a framework, a brief look at what it is that makes Amsterdam unique, a rundown of the episodes to come in the rest of the series. In short, everything you need to set you up for what's to come. And I, for one, am really looking forward to it because what a beautiful city Amsterdam is. Here, for example, is Russell Shorto, author of Amsterdam, setting the scene by describing the view from his window when he lived there. Quote, "Several of the classic elements of the city's charm. There was a trough of languid water, the little boats moored by the quay, the row of tilting gabled buildings on the opposite bank, and, on any given day, a couple of bicycles chained to the railing of a hump-backed bridge." I hope that's whetted your appetite. So just to try out one more piece of Dutch, I think this might mean let's go. Laten, gaan. So then, getting your bearings, Northern Europe, on the North Sea coastline, just where the River Amstel flows into the North Sea, in fact. So yes, it is a city with a waterfront, but you might not notice that straight away because it's hidden behind the vast Centraal Station, and you will only see the coastline if you go round the back of that. And that's a clue to what is so special about Amsterdam. The Dutch have a saying, God made the earth, but the Dutch made Holland. And it's true because they've somehow managed to build their beautiful city on what really ought to be marshland. Starting with the first settlers, who dug out earth from the swamps and made little islands with it, and then built dikes to keep the areas enclosed, nice and drained. Then they started joining them up and brought in windmills to drive pumps to keep the water out. How were they going to build houses? Well, wooden piles are your friend here, driven right down 12 metres or more, through the sand until solid earth was reached, and then building on top of those. Quite an amazing feat. I read somewhere the following. Every Dutch schoolchild knows that the Royal Palace is supported on 13,659 wooden piles to keep it from sinking into the swamp on which Amsterdam stands unsteadily. And if you're of a nervous disposition, you might like to know that way back in the 15th century this was already the case. Erasmus noted, for example, quote, "The inhabitants of Amsterdam live like crows upon the tops of trees." Today then it's a city of some 150 canals, 700 or so bridges, and to get the hang of the canal system, best to remember that there are 4 main ones looping down in concentric circles from the station, the Centraal Station, and that the medieval heart of the city lies in the centre of all of that. These main canals were built in the 17th century, known as the Golden Age of Amsterdam, and there'll be lots more on that in future episodes, but for the meanwhile, here's a good summary from a book cleverly called H2 Holland, written by Martin Ascher. Quote, "Extremely practical considerations informed the city's expansion during its 17th century prime, when, from its medieval heart by a dam in the River Amstel, it spread in all directions with ever wider concentric canals. From 1612, the single was followed by the Herengracht, gracht by the way means canal, the Keizersgracht, and finally, the longest of all, the Prinsengracht. In 1658, they were extended eastward, which gave them their distinctive horseshoe shape. 2 main squares are the principal features within that inner ring, they being Dam Square, the one with the Royal Palace, and the city's main church and the National War Memorial, not to mention lots of shops and theatres and buskers. And secondly, Rembrandtplein, or Rembrandt Square, transport hub, and yes, dominated by a statue, of course, of Rembrandt. Key suburbs around this central area would include, to the west, Jordaan, a former working-class district, the place where they chose to site the noisy, smelly factories on which the city's wealth was founded, but which today is a picturesque and rather trendy little area. To the south of the city, the Museum Quarter, the place where you will find grouped close together the Rijksmuseum, the Van Gogh Museum, the big concert hall, other galleries, all sorts of interesting things, and also the Vondelpark, the city's biggest, finest park. And then round on the other side, to the east, Plantage, the former Jewish area, so the place where you will find synagogues and the Jewish Museum and whatnot, but also a green area, the place where both the Botanical Garden and the zoo, not to mention other parks, are also sited. So that's a very quick introduction to what is where. As for a little bit of history, unusually for a city break city, there is no mention of the Romans that I could find anyway, but rather the city seems to have begun life in the 13th century as a small fishing village. The earliest inhabitants gathered here, built dikes on both sides of the river, and then in about 1270 they built a dam between them. Originally they were fishermen, something they proved very good at, to the point where a century or two later they were catching 200 million a year. All of that led into other trades, for example boat building, and to the rise of a merchant class, people who bought and sold things, initially taking Dutch goods, particularly fish, elsewhere, and then gradually bringing other goods back, or indeed taking them elsewhere, making the most, in fact, of the position that Holland was in, sandwiched between the Baltic countries and southern Europe. This is all well explained by Russell Shorto in Amsterdam. Quote, "The city's merchants became savvy international traders. They paid top dollar for information about faraway events that they could earn money on, and adjusted their cargo accordingly. When harvests in southern Europe failed, the city's vessels returned from their herring runs to the Baltic port of Danzig, laden with rye and wheat, so that Dutch vessels provided Polish grain for tables in Spain and Italy. The ships likewise carried wine from France to the Baltic, and brought beer from Germany for Dutch consumption. The awarding of the city's charter in 1306 saw much rapid expansion, and by the 15th century Amsterdam was the country's biggest commercial town and port, a centre of wealth and influence throughout Europe. Very much an onwards and upwards trajectory, except that twice in the 15th century, 1421 and 1452, enormous fires did great damage, and there was quite a lot of starting again. The 16th century was characterised really mostly by religious conflict, something called in a rather understated way the Alteration, which was in fact a major upheaval to the way people lived their lives in Amsterdam. So at the beginning of the 16th century they were ruled by the Habsburgs from Spain, therefore very Catholic, but then came a rebellion in 1578 known as the Bloodless Revolution, led by William I, Prince of Orange, the result of which was that many of the city's leaders were expelled, Roman Catholic priests were deported, and the Dutch Reformed Church took over. This had a knock-on effect when Protestants from surrounding areas flocked to Amsterdam, feeling that they could live there in safety. And then, as the city began to acquire a reputation for tolerance, so too came the Jews expelled from other countries, particularly hundreds of Jewish families expelled from Portugal and more from Germany and Eastern Europe. This huge influx of different peoples encouraged an enrichment of the city's life culturally, intellectually, commercially. Many businesses were started and grew, particularly in banking and shipbuilding. The idea of Amsterdam as a merchant city grew ever more, and one statistic which conveys this mighty change is the fact that between 1565 and 1618, so a period of 50 years or 2 generations perhaps, the population of the city more than tripled. And all of this left Amsterdam poised for the golden age which was ushered in as the 17th century began. It was founded particularly on the fact that new trade routes were being added. Dutch ships were going ever further to the East Indies, to South America, and capitalising on all the possibilities for trading goods. A key date, 1602, is when the Dutch East India Company was formed. You'll see references to that all over the city, often in the form of 3 initials, VOC, which stands for the rather unpronounceable words that mean East India Company, namely Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, or something like that. If it's something you want to know more about, make a note that the Scheepvaart Museum up near the docks is the place to do that. So, lots of wealth, obviously plans are evolved for spending it, not least from 1612, something known as the Three Canals Plan, the three main canals, Herengracht, Keizersgracht and Prinsengracht. And 20 years after that, the new City Hall, built in Dam Square, still there today and called from a different era the Royal Palace. Amsterdam was now the financial, trading and cultural centre of the world, I think it's no exaggeration to say. It was lending money to foreign kings and emperors, wielding huge political influence, acquiring new territories abroad. For example, in 1664 they took possession of some land which they were going to call New Amsterdam on the east coast of America, although later they swapped it, would you believe, with the English for Suriname. The English took it over, renamed it, and today it's still known as New York. I've seen this described as the worst swap deal in history. Perhaps if it hadn't occurred, we'd all be speaking Dutch, not English. There was at least one major blip in the Golden Age century, and that was in the 1630s, when the tulip mania led to the Great Tulip Crash, a story I'll definitely be retelling later. By the 18th century, other cities were beginning to catch up, not least London and Hamburg, and there were periods of occupation. Prussians arrived in 1787, Napoleon and his troops turned up in 1795, and as Napoleon tended to do, he of course had a major influence, although not for very long. So firstly, he put an embargo on trade with Britain, part of his long-running dispute with those pesky Brits, and that of course had a huge effect on the trading city of Amsterdam. Even more so, in 1806 he proclaimed that the Netherlands would be a kingdom from now on, Amsterdam would be the capital, and the king would be one Louis Bonaparte, his younger brother. Actually, all of this only lasted a few years, and by 1814 another William, Prince of Orange, was crowned King of the Netherlands in the city's Nieuwe Kerk in Dam Square. In the 19th century, although the Netherlands was no longer preeminent in terms of trading around the world, they were still doing business with something like 660 ports around the globe. Lots of money was coming in from trade with the East Indies, to name but one venture, and the money from it was spent on projects like the North Sea Canal, built in the 1870s, giving the city a direct link to the North Sea, and standout beautiful buildings which are still there today, such as the Centraal Station, completed in 1889, and its sort of twin or companion, the Rijksmuseum. They do look rather similar, and that's because they were designed by the same architect. So both of those are features of late 19th century, well-off Amsterdam. Also the period, incidentally, when the diamond trade took off. The Netherlands was neutral during the First World War, but heavily impacted by the Second. The German army occupied from 1940. They were badly bombed by the Allies as well, and the fate of the Jews, as in so many other countries, was a dreadful one, illustrated, of course, for most of us by the story of Anne Frank, who sort of represents the 70,000 Jews who were deported from the Netherlands to the death camps. In fact, it's said that 71% of Dutch Jews ended up in concentration camps, a higher percentage than any other country in Europe except for Poland. Which isn't to say that there wasn't a Dutch resistance. There certainly was, but conditions were dreadful, particularly later in the war. The winter of 1944-5, for example, is known still today in Holland as the Hunger Winter, when thousands of people died due to a combination of freezing conditions and a major lack of food and supplies. Rebuilding began in earnest during the 1950s, and a key date, 1957, when Holland was one of the founder members of the European Common Market, the forerunner of the European Union. So that was quite a skate through the main events, lots of which I will be coming back to in future episodes, with references to museums and other places you can visit to find out more about all these things. So let's move on to what is it that makes Amsterdam unique? And the answer, of course, is quite a lot of things. But I think where I'd have to start would be with the canals and the bridges, and the rows of gabled houses canal side, and all the boats, especially the houseboats, lined up along the sides of so many of them. The bridges too, more than 1,200 I think, typically little humped-back bridges. And one fact that sort of encapsulates the whole thing, if you stand on the corner of two canals, the Herengracht and the Reguliersgracht, you will see 15 bridges all at once. Well, you will if you look round in each direction, and also if you count the one you're standing on. So you'll see 14, but anyway, quite an amazing fact. And that is one of the features of a visit to Amsterdam, isn't it? Lots of wandering, whether on foot or by boat, and just snapping all those lovely vistas when a new set of canal-side houses or a new little bridge comes into view. Absolutely typical are the endless humped-back bridges with little cobbled pavements. A couple with names that stand out would be the Magere Brug, which means skinny bridge, an almost obligatory feature of any film set in Amsterdam, and named, in fact, not particularly because of its shape, but because, according to legend anyway, there was once a pair of sisters who lived one each side of the bridge, which, if you believe the story, was actually built so that they could visit each other more often. And yes, they were both very skinny, so it was named after them, apparently. And to mention, for the moment at least, just one more, the one which won the International Footbridge Award in 2002, no less, the Python Bridge, a red snake-like shaped number. But really, when you get home and think about the bridges, I think it'll be those little humpbacked ones that are everywhere that you will have in your mind and your camera. Canal-side vistas aside, the other thing that will definitely be of huge memory for anybody who's been to Amsterdam is the bicycle, of which there are about 2 million. They call them twee-wheelers, apparently. I think twee might be the word for two. And if there really are that many, that is in fact almost 2 per person. There's nothing smart and modern about them, on the whole. Think vintage models. No gears. Well, there are no hills, so they don't really need them. Baskets on the front, on the handlebars, often overflowing with study materials, flowers, shopping, and something you will definitely look twice at when you first spot it, little sort of sidecar things for toddlers, so that parents can push back around with one, or sometimes even more than one, small child safely tucked up behind a polythene cover. And apart from the endless bikes on the endless cycle paths, you will also notice a good number parked, locked onto bridges, sometimes just left while the owner goes off and does something, but sometimes left as advertising boards, so nicely painted, perhaps flowers flowing out of the basket on the front, and a little sign telling you that this bakery or that museum is just around the corner. You'd have to say too, wouldn't you, that Amsterdam really is a city of art, not just because every view in every direction seems to have something picturesque about it, but because of the famous artists very much connected to the city. Rembrandt, of course, the city's most famous resident during the Golden Age in the 17th century. He lived and worked in Amsterdam for almost the whole of his career. But then the others too, Van Gogh, who lived here on and off, and to whom these days there's a whole museum dedicated, but also other Dutch artists, Vermeer, for example, and Frans Hals, both big stars of the Rijksmuseum. More prosaically, it's the city, in my mind anyway, of the stroopwafel, a sticky, sugary snack available absolutely everywhere. Think thin wafer biscuits sandwiched together with syrup. You might get mini ones with your coffee or after a meal. You might buy huge plate-sized ones from market stalls or takeaway stands, or indeed specialist shops. I think it's probably the must-try snack of the city. Less tangibly, you'd have to add that Amsterdam is a city of trade and business. Voltaire called it the warehouse of the world. Somebody else, whose name I forget, wrote that other countries make goods. The Dutch buy, sell and move them. And writing in 1635, so just at the dawn of the Golden Age, the philosopher Descartes had this to say: "In this city there is nobody who does not trade in something. Everyone is preoccupied by his own profit, such that I could live here all my life without ever being noticed by anyone." While I think he was allowing himself a little exaggeration, it is certainly true that Amsterdam is built on trade. I think because of its key position on a coast between North and South Europe, Also very much thanks to the Dutch East India Company, which I have seen described as the world's first ever multinational company. The idea of Amsterdam as a hub is also reinforced by its airport, Schiphol, not just the airport for arriving in Holland, but a hugely important international hub, a much, much bigger airport than you would expect really in a country the size of Holland. Something else which is even harder to define, the word liberalism. Amsterdam has a long tradition of tolerance, whether we're referring to the religious tolerance of earlier centuries or to the fact in the 21st century that things are accepted here in Amsterdam which would not be tolerated so openly elsewhere. Here is the author Russell Shorto explaining that. Quote, Amsterdam is famous for one thing, besides canals and cannabis cafes and prostitutes, the tattered, ancient, much misunderstood word, liberalism. Amsterdam is, by most accounts, the most liberal place on earth. It's a concept that's quite hard to explain, but see what you think when you visit. Something that's much easier to explain, my last example of something very typical of Amsterdam, and this will come as a surprise to you if you know nothing about Holland or the city, it's the colour orange. The national colour of Holland, think football teams, etc., and very much celebrated in Amsterdam, particularly on special occasions. I very much enjoyed a reference to this which I saw in a book called My Damn Life by Sean Condon, an account of the 3 years that he spent living in Amsterdam. And here he's describing what was called Queen's Day, the national day, which I think now is probably King's Day. Anyway, here he is. It was the day before Queen's Day, and all over the country the subjects of the House of Orange were getting orange fever. Cafes, restaurants and bars were festooned with orange crepe paper, orange-framed pictures of Queen Beatrix, and flashing orange lights. Multivlae, the Limburg-based cake manufacturers, had proclaimed this Orange Week and were selling special orange vlees with apricot, carrot, peach and scallop toppings. Billboards featuring women wearing orange underwear were everywhere. Sales of orange juice soared. Orange Boom beer was the alcohol of the moment. Orangina was liquid gold. So there you have it, some things to think about and look out for when you're tramping the streets and sailing the canals of Amsterdam. Which brings me to the rest of the series, episodes to come. Next time I'm going to do something called 5 walks around Amsterdam. So just ideas for little walking routes which will take you past many of the main sites, a bit of information about them here and there, all fairly brief because a lot of the bigger and more important places I'll be coming back to after that. Episode 3 is going to be on the canals, the history of them, their atmosphere, visits to at least 3 places which can tell you much more about them, namely the Canal Museum, a furnished canal house now open as a museum, and the Houseboat Museum where you can learn about the people who choose to live their lives actually on the waters of the city. Episode 4 is going to focus on the churches and tell the story of religion in the city, which is a very interesting one, with such facets as hidden churches built on the upper floor of a canal house so that worshippers of a certain religion could carry out their practices in secret. Then episode 5 I think I'm going to call Rembrandt and the Golden Age, so have a look at the bustling atmosphere of 17th century Amsterdam, with visits certainly to the Rembrandt House and 1 or 2 of the history museums. Episode 6 will be on the Jewish Quarter, so a little bit of history, plus visits to the Portuguese Synagogue and the Jewish Museum and the Holocaust Museum, leading into episode 7 on World War II. So Anne Frank's story, for sure, but also a visit to the Verzet's Museum, the Dutch Resistance Museum, where you can learn a lot about daily life in Amsterdam during the 1940s. Episode 8 is going to focus on the Rijksmuseum, the world-renowned art gallery, surely visited by practically everybody who comes to Amsterdam. So a little bit about the museum itself, some potted biographies of the best-known artists connected to it, a little bit about some of the works you can see there. And then episode 9, a follow-up really, on the Van Gogh Museum and what you can see there, along with bits and pieces about 1 or 2 other art galleries in the city. Episode 10 is going to have the most unusual title, I think, something like Tulips and Diamonds, because both those products are very much connected to Amsterdam and both have some fascinating stories attached to them. Episode 11, Food and Shopping, and to finish off, an anthology episode with, I'm not quite sure what yet, but hopefully some travel writing, perhaps some history and biography, and certainly some literary extracts. A whole range of ways, in short, of viewing the city from different perspectives and finding out what some of those who are good with words had to say about it. That then is the plan, which I hope leaves you eager to hear some or all of those episodes and top up your knowledge of the history and culture of Amsterdam, which will surely inform your visit if you're lucky enough to be going, or will awaken lots of memories if you've already been, or maybe which will just be of general historical and cultural interest. Do remember that there's a blog post to go with every episode, so a summary of all the material given, lots of links to the places I've mentioned, ideas for further reading, some nice pictures. In short, a handy summary of the podcast, or indeed a substitute for it if you're a bit short of time that particular week. So, hoping that you'll be back to join me for some or all of that, I'm just going to have a go at saying thank you and goodbye in Dutch, which I hasten to add I really do not speak at all. But anyway, here goes. Thank you, I believe, is either dank u wel or sometimes hartelijk dank. And then there's a short and sharp little phrase for goodbye, which goes like this, I think. Tot ziens.